morning. It's great to be here this morning. Unfortunately, I have to begin with an apology, and I know it will be a big disappointment to many of you, but unfortunately, I have no PowerPoint slides to share with you. I'm so sorry. What I'm going to do is focus, the theme of a lot of yesterday's discussion has been around exponential growth and growing abundance in the economy. We've had a bit of an undercurrent around disruption and death. I'm going to focus on something even more fundamental as a result of all these changes, which is mounting performance pressure. Mounting pressure on all of us as individuals and as institutions. At the level of individuals, we talked a bit about this yesterday in terms of the future of work, and the robots are coming to take our jobs. That's a fair amount of pressure. But again, there's something even more fundamental, which is even if the robots don't take our job, increasingly we are in an intensely competitive global labor market where no matter what talent and credentials we have, we're increasingly competing with talent all around the world. And so there's a lot of pressure to keep improving our talent and capability. At the level of institutions, the pressure takes many different forms. There's one form which is the impact of all this digital technology is to systematically and substantially reduce barriers to entry and barriers to movement on a global scale. Competition is intensifying. There's another form of pressure, which is that because of the accelerating pace of change, we've seen more and more studies done that show the compression of product life cycles. You know, it used to be if you came up with a great new product and got it into market quickly, you could kind of sit back and relax. Great. Now the question is, what's next? And how soon can you get that on the market? Because the window you have to celebrate that success is getting shorter and shorter. And then, of course, you have the extreme events, the disruptive events that come in out of nowhere and disrupt. Now, those are all words. Actually, we did a study in the United States to look at the impact of all this digital technology on companies. We looked at all public companies in the US, all companies listed on a public exchange. We went back for a series of decades to 1965, a few years before digital technology really came into the business world, until today. And we took as our measure of performance, it's not perfect, but we think good enough, measure of performance was return on assets. So with all this amazing technology, all this amazing opportunity, how has performance changed over time? From 1965 until today for all public companies in the United States. Performance has collapsed over that time period. Return on assets has gone down from 1965 until today by over 75%. And there is absolutely no sign of it leveling off, certainly no sign of it turning around. So if you want an indicator of mounting performance pressure and our increasing inability to respond to that pressure, we think that's a pretty good indicator. So yes, disruption and death, those events that get all the headlines, but everyone is feeling that pressure. And it's continuing to intensify over time. Now, one of the reasons I focus on this as the opening of my talk is because I think that when we talk about exponential technology, there's often a reaction which is, wow, that's an extraordinary opportunity. You know, but I'm really busy this year. I've got so much going on and so many resources, I don't have enough resources. Maybe next year. Maybe the year after. One of the key messages I want to leave you with is this is not an opportunity. This is an imperative. There is no choice. Either we find a way to harness this exponential technology, or we go down. All of us. And it's not out in the distant future. It's today. In fact, it's been going on for decades, from 1965 until today. And it's just going to continue to intensify. So, with that context, I want to focus on what do we do about this? What's the response that we need to address this mounting performance pressure? And at a very high level, I'm going to focus on three things that I believe are an imperative. One is rethinking strategy. Second, reframe innovation. And then third, refocus transformation. I'm going to go at a very high level. I should say that a lot of this is based on the research that we've done at my center, and all the research we have is freely available. So if you're interested, just reach out. Happy to share more of these perspectives with you. But let me start with rethinking strategy. As was mentioned, I've been in Silicon Valley now for almost 40 years. And over that time, I've watched some of the most successful technology companies and looked at how they think about strategy and what kind of strategies they pursue. And it's a very different approach to strategy relative to most traditional companies. It's something that I call the zoom out, zoom in approach to strategy. Basically, it focuses on two time horizons in parallel. One time horizon is 10 to 20 years. And on that horizon, the two questions are, what is our relevant market or industry likely to look like 10 to 20 years from now? And then secondly, what are the implications for the kind of company we're going to need to be 10 to 20 years from now? That's the zoom out. Zoom in, very different time horizon. That time horizon is 6 to 12 months. And on that horizon, the questions are, what are the 2 or 3 business initiatives, no more, 2 or 3, that we could pursue in the next 6 to 12 months that would have the greatest potential to accelerate our movement towards that longer-term destination? Secondly, do we have a critical mass of resources against those 2 or 3 initiatives in the next 6 to 12 months? And then finally, what are the metrics we could use at the end of 6 to 12 months? How would we determine what we've accomplished, whether we've succeeded or not? What could we learn from those initiatives? So 2 very different time horizons, 10 to 20 years, 6 to 12 months. Now, when you look at most traditional institutions, when they do strategy, what is strategy? It's the 5-year plan. Year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5. That's our strategy. Interesting observation. The companies that I'm talking about spend almost no time on 1 to 5 years. Their belief is if they get it right on the 10 to 20 year horizon and the 6 to 12 month horizon, everything else will take care of itself. Fundamentally different perspective around the relevant horizons to focus on. And I think it has a number of benefits, this zoom out, zoom in. One is if you think about the 5-year plan, when you get the leadership team together and look ahead 5 years, you can pretty much convince yourself your company's going to be basically what it is today. It might have some incremental change to it, but it's basically the same company, same business, same industry. If you truly understand exponential change and you zoom out 10 to 20 years from now, and you believe you're going to be in the same company, in the same industry 10 to 20 years from now, I would say you need to step back and rethink. And I think it forces leadership out of their comfort zone. Rather than 5 years where you can again get comfortable that you're going to be the way you are today, 10 to 20 years forces you to challenge even the most basic assumptions about what business am I really in. The other thing it helps to do, and this is an issue that I encounter when I deal with companies around the world, large companies of all areas, is one of the big challenges I'm hearing is we're spread way too thin across so many initiatives. And it's partly because I think the reaction of a lot of people when confronted with this accelerating change is to fall into what I would describe as a reactive approach to strategy. Just sense and respond as quickly as you can to whatever's going on at the moment, launch an initiative here, an initiative there, and before you know it, you have so many initiatives, nothing is adequately funded. This approach, zoom out, zoom in, forces the question of focus in the short term. What are those 2 or 3 initiatives that are going to have the greatest impact, and do they have a critical mass of resources? It's not to say you're only going to do 2 or 3 initiatives, but make sure those 2 or 3 initiatives, the most important ones, are getting adequately resourced. So, very different approach to strategy. And I will say that another difference is I think many companies now are engaging in what's described as scenario planning, scenario development. You take the leadership team off and they go off and imagine the future, the different alternative futures. They may even pick one future that's the most likely. And then the meeting's over. They go back to their day job and nothing changes. It was an interesting conceptual theoretical exercise in the future, but we have work to do. Let's get back to it. This approach says the meeting is not over until we have identified the 2 or 3 initiatives in the next 6 to 12 months and ensured that they have a critical mass of resources. Now, all of a sudden, that theoretical conceptual exercise about the future becomes very real and today, not just out in the future. So I think it's an interesting alternative approach to strategy. Our belief is it's actually an imperative in terms of how we deal with times of exponential change. Let me talk about this other notion of reframing innovation. I participate in leadership meetings of companies around the world, and no matter what industry, what country, I can virtually guarantee whenever there's a leadership meeting, somewhere on the agenda is innovation. Everybody's talking about it. We need to be more innovative. But what I find when we get to that topic of innovation is we tend to focus very quickly, very narrowly on product and service innovation. How can we come up with more creative products and services, get them into market quickly, and be innovative? In some more sophisticated companies, we might actually talk about process innovation, maybe even business model innovation. I want to suggest that there's another level of innovation that is not on the agenda, but needs to be. It's what I call institutional innovation. It's going back to the most fundamental question of all, which is why do we have large institutions? You know, in the course of human history, this is a relatively recent development. Now, there was an economist back in 1937 who tried to answer the question of why these large institutions were emerging around the world. He wrote an essay to try to answer that question. It was a pretty good essay. He actually won the Nobel Prize in economics for the essay. His name was Ronald Coase. And at the risk of oversimplifying a very subtle and nuanced perspective, his basic answer to the question of why we have large institutions emerging was scalable efficiency. That it's much easier and lower cost to coordinate activity across a large number of people if they're all within a single institution. And at the time he wrote this essay, in 1937, remarkably accurate and perceptive in terms of what was driving the growth of large institutions. Our belief is that in the current year, we need to really step back and challenge, is that rationale, scalable efficiency, still as compelling today as it was back in 1937? And if not, what is an alternative rationale that would drive the success of large institutions in the future? And how can we innovate around that rationale? Our belief is there is a rationale, a very different rationale from scalable efficiency. It's what we describe as scalable learning. And that the reason we're going to come together in large institutions in the future is because we will learn faster together as part of a large institution than we ever could on our own or as part of a smaller organization. But that's a fundamentally different rationale from scalable efficiency. And I will say, when I talk to executives about this, scalable efficiency, scalable learning, one of the reactions I get is, wow, that's really interesting. We'll do both, scalable efficiency and scalable learning. At the risk of being provocative, I want to suggest you can't do both. You have to choose. Which one is it? Scalable efficiency or scalable learning? Why do I say that? Well, let me start with a key message, and we kind of touched on it a bit yesterday, but one of the key messages in a scalable efficiency institution to everyone, virtually on a daily basis, failure is not an option. You deliver as predicted, as forecast, reliably and efficiently. Okay, got the message. Guess what? If you're not failing, you're not learning fast enough. Learning requires failure. So which is it? Not an option or a necessary? And then let's think about the environments we've created for scalable efficiency. What kind of environment? Well, we've tightly specified every activity that needs to be done. We've highly standardized the activities so they're done in exactly the same efficient way, no matter where in the organization. And then we've tightly integrated all those activities. Eliminate all those inefficient buffers in between activities. Think about those environments. Tightly specified, highly standardized, tightly integrated. Where's the room to improvise, to experiment, to test new approaches? There is no room. We've created prisons. It's one of the reasons why when I talk about learning to most executives, the conversation very quickly shifts to training programs. Yes, we have learning. We take workers out of the work environment, we send them to a training room, they can learn all they want in that training room, and then they go back into the work environment and do their jobs as told without failure. Our belief is the most powerful learning in an exponentially changing world is not transmitting existing knowledge to others, as you do in a training room. It's creating new knowledge, something that nobody knew before, by confronting unexpected situations in the work environment, day to day on the job. So that's where the most powerful learning needs to occur. And it's by working together to learn faster. Now that's pretty abstract and conceptual. Our belief is that actually there's an opportunity to redesign the work environments that we have. Take design thinking that's so popular these days and apply it to our work environments and say, if our primary design objective is to accelerate learning and performance improvement in the work environment, what would that work environment look like? And not just the physical environment, but the virtual environment, the IT tools and platforms that workers interact with, the management systems, the entire worker experience. What would it look like? if the primary design goal is to accelerate learning and performance improvement. We did a major research initiative around this, and we actually could not find a single company that has even undertaken this, thought about it, much less pursued it in the work environment. We did find a lot of companies. We ended up doing 75 case studies around companies that had done interesting pieces of work environment redesign, just a piece of the work environment, with some very powerful and interesting results. Just to give you a quick example, there was one company called Liveops. Liveops runs customer call centers on an outsourced basis for other larger companies. One interesting thing about Liveops is they actually have no call centers. They have a workforce of 20,000 people, and they all work from their homes. And they've created a sophisticated platform to route the right calls to the right home at the right time to be answered by the right person. But the interesting thing, one of the interesting things about Liveops is the founders of the company took great inspiration from an online video game. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's called the World of Warcraft. And one of the elements in World of Warcraft is all the players have a performance dashboard that gives them real-time feedback on how they're doing in the game, on multiple dimensions of performance. The founders of Liveops got excited about this and said, wow, let's give one of these performance dashboards to every one of our employees, so they have real-time feedback on how they're doing on multiple dimensions of performance. Now, I would suggest if most traditional companies implemented that kind of performance dashboard, it would be used as an instrument of punishment. Right? You're falling behind on these 3 dimensions of performance. You know, you have 6 months to get your act together, you're out of here. Liveops did something very different. They encouraged the workers who are having performance issues to ask for help. And they created an online environment, a discussion forum, where a worker could go in and say, I'm having trouble handling this kind of call. Does anybody have any ideas or suggestions on how I can improve my performance? And most importantly, Liveops started to watch, recognize, and reward the workers who are emerging as coaches and helpers of the workers having performance issues. So what they were doing was creating a very powerful peer-to-peer learning environment. Just an interesting example if you took scalable learning seriously. The other dimension I just want to briefly highlight is scalable learning. I take great inspiration from a Silicon Valley entrepreneur by the name of Bill Joy, who once made the observation. He said, look, no matter how many smart people you have within your organization, just remember one thing. There are a lot more smart people outside your organization than inside. And so if you're really committed to scalable learning, but you just focus on the employees within your own enterprise, you will never scale learning to the extent of companies that systematically reach out and build relationships to connect with expertise outside the company and learn together. Very different kind of mindset. In that context, I'll just briefly highlight a company that we've studied, actually from China, called Lianfeng. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's in the clothing and apparel industry. Their customers are apparel designers, all the brand names that we know and recognize. They take care of everything from sourcing of raw material through all the stages of production, all the logistics, delivering anywhere in the world you specify as an apparel designer. Interesting observation about Lianfeng. They actually do none of that themselves. They operate through a global network of 15,000 business partners with deep expertise in all aspects of clothing production. And they've become very sophisticated orchestrating activities on a global scale for these customers. Interesting in terms of scalable learning, we went out and interviewed many of the partners in their network, And we asked them, why are you part of the Li and Feng network? Without exception, top of mind, the answer we got back, because we learned faster as part of the Li and Feng network than we ever could on our own or as part of anyone else's network. I've interviewed partners of many companies, and I have never gotten that answer. Because we learn faster? No, we get squeezed harder. So I think it's a fundamentally different mindset and, again, perspective around if you take seriously this notion of scalable learning, how do you build larger and larger networks? Interesting observation, at the same time that many companies are shrinking the number of participants in their supply chains. Why? Scalable efficiency. It's more efficient to have fewer partners. Li and Feng, with 15,000 business partners, every day is adding new partners. Because their belief is the more partners they have in their network, the faster everyone's going to learn. Again, very different mindset and approach. But huge opportunity to innovate around reframing at an institutional level. Why do we have an institution? Is it scalable efficiency? Or is it scalable learning? And if it's scalable learning, how could we innovate everything in the organization to accomplish that? And that leads me to my third topic, which is refocusing transformation. Because if you take scalable learning seriously, we're talking about changing everything in most traditional companies. That's transformation. And the question is, how do we do that? I will say I've been involved in transformation activities now for several decades. I really only have one lesson to share with you from all that experience. And that lesson is, if you believe that transformation is a rational process, if you believe it's about getting the right data, doing the right analytics, putting it on the right charts, presenting it to the right people, you've already lost. In my experience, transformation is not a rational process. It is fundamentally a political process. And it really only has three objectives: easy to state, difficult to pursue. First objective, identify and neutralize by all means possible the enemies of change. Now, that's not as easy as it sounds, because at least in my experience, I have never been in a leadership meeting of a company where an executive has stood up and announced, "I am an enemy of change." Maybe you have. In my experience, in those leadership meetings, everybody sits around the table and smiles and nods and says, "Yes, we need to change." And then they go into the privacy of their offices to conspire to figure out how to undermine that process of change. So not easy to identify the enemies of change. Second objective, identify and strengthen by all means possible the champions of change. And then there's a third objective, which tends to be a bit counterintuitive, but I get great inspiration from a book that I hope many of you read. I certainly recommend it if you haven't. It's called The Art of War. And one of the key messages in The Art of War is if you have to engage the enemy in battle, you've already lost the war. The key goal is to postpone confrontation between the enemies of change and the champions of change until the enemies have become so weak and the champions so strong that a battle isn't even necessary. It's a foregone conclusion of who's going to win. But it fights that natural tendency we have. If we get conviction that we need to change, we want to do battle and get it over with as quickly as possible. And the traditional approach to large-scale transformation is a leader gets up and announces we need to change everything. And because we have to change everything, it's going to cost a lot of money. Or a large organization can't do this on a shoestring. And because we're going to change everything, it's going to take a long time. You can't turn around a battleship overnight. But trust me, at the end of the day, wonderful things are going to happen. In my experience, what that leader has just done is put a red bullseye on their back and invited the immune system and the antibodies that, again, in my experience, exist in every large existing institution to mobilize, to crush. It's going to take a lot of money. Where's that money coming from? Not from my pockets. It's going to take a long time. I got pressure on the quarterly performance. I can't afford to be distracted by this long-term thing. So I think the key question is, how do you avoid that immune system and the antibodies? And in our view, there's an alternative approach to transformation that is now becoming much more feasible and has much greater potential to drive transformation. It's what we call scaling the edge. And this approach says, if you're serious about transformation, find an edge to your existing institution that today is relatively modest in terms of revenue and profitability. But if you understand the long-term forces that are driving change in your markets and industries, has the potential, that edge has the potential to scale to the point where it becomes the new core of your business. Not just a diversification or a growth initiative, it will be the new core of your business over time. And focus on scaling that edge and driving the transformation through that edge rather than trying to do it in the core of the business. And rather than taking that edge and pushing it back into the core as a catalyst for change, resist that temptation because, again, at least in my experience, the immune system and antibodies are very effective at identifying those foreign bodies as they come in and mobilizing to crush. Instead, take that edge and scale it, and over time, pull more and more of the people and resources from the core out to that edge, to the point where it does become the new core of the business. Very different approach to transformation. I'll just mention as one example of scaling the edge, it's from a U.S. bank, a relatively old bank in the U.S. called State Street Bank, founded in 1793. And that bank, for most of its history, was a very traditional retail bank. Branches took deposits, gave out loans. Back in the 1970s, started to experience increasing margin pressure in the retail banking business. And one executive in the bank one day came up with this idea. He said, in our back office, we have world-class transaction processing capability. What if we rented out some of that capacity to other banks that are experiencing financial pressure? Long story short, tapped into an extraordinary unmet need, a growing unmet need on the part of financial institutions. And now State Street Bank is basically an outsourcing provider to financial institutions for back office transactions. And they've essentially shut down virtually all of their retail banking operations. That is the new core of their business. So, I think a lot of ground that we've covered here started with this notion of mounting performance pressure and the fact that we have an imperative to change. It's not just an opportunity, it's an imperative because of this increasing pressure. There's a need to rethink strategy, need to focus on zoom out, zoom in as a different set of time frames. This notion of refocusing innovation around institutional innovation, innovating around that basic rationale, scalable efficiency to scalable learning. And then an alternative approach to transformation. Rather than going top-down, big bang, scale an edge and drive the transformation in that way to avoid the immune system and antibodies coming after you. So I'll just say, in conclusion, I started on a pessimistic note around the mounting performance pressure. I will say I started my career many, many years ago at a firm called Boston Consulting Group, BCG. And in the early days, a bit of an exaggeration, but they made their reputation on one chart. It was basically the experience curve. and it showed how performance improved in markets and industries around the world. Very effective, very accurate description of performance improvement. The challenge is the experience curve is a diminishing returns curve. The more experience you get, the longer and harder you have to work to get that next increment of performance improvement. That is the result of scalable efficiency. Scalable efficiency is a diminishing returns game. Our belief in an exponential world, if you focus on scalable learning, for the first time we have an opportunity to create increasing returns curves, where more and more value is going to get created as more people participate in driving that value through scalable learning. So with that, I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you very much.